Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Deion Johnson. The names and hashtags seem to continue to grow by the day and by the week, and it feels overwhelming at times. So much so that it makes it hard to breathe. I'm sure you've seen the headlines. Protesters have joined forces across the nation and internationally to declare that Black Lives Matter. What you haven't always seen, though, are images like these. Acts of service, the power of prayer, human connection, and unity.
Thank you, Lord. Amen.
That's what my friend and culture journalist Neima Abdulahi has been capturing in the streets of Atlanta. So to tell us the things that she's seen, captured, and witnessed for herself via Zoom right this minute, we've got my friend and culture journalist Neima Abdulahi. Hey!
Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Neima, you've been there with the protesters on the ground. Tell us what you've seen and heard.
There was an uncompromising public outcry for justice. And what we saw displayed in Atlanta, Kentucky, Minneapolis, all over the country is that the non-healing wounds of the past have once again resurfaced. What we saw were moments of prayer. What we saw was moments to be heard. And we also saw a lot of people from different racial backgrounds come out to join together as humanity and be there for one another during such a terrible time for our nation right now.
Neima, what really struck me was the woman who knelt down and prayed with those National Guardsmen. I mean, those are some of the images that people like to promote on Facebook, saying there is good coming out of some of this.
There is, and the dialogue that has happened between protesters and law enforcement was very powerful. Some people were using this as an opportunity to confront and have conversations that they never have had access to before. You don't want to be in a position to have these conversations when you get in trouble or when something bad happens to someone in your community. So this was a rare opportunity for them to have unfiltered opportunity to not necessarily always have a dialogue, but to be heard and to feel heard. But that moment of prayer really brought it down to a spiritual level. The march within itself is a spiritual journey. So for that woman to take a moment to acknowledge God during that moment, I think really brought her closer to looking at them beyond the uniform.
I know it's hard to quantify and put numbers to things like this, but can you tell us overwhelmingly, was it more peaceful or more chaotic, like the images that we tend to see on the news?
I think it was more peaceful, but the images that oftentimes go viral on social media, as you and I both know, are the images of disruption, images of buildings burning down, images of, riots and things like that. But that's only 5% of what's actually happening in the streets. So oftentimes that paints only from one perspective, where the people who marched 9 hours. I mean, when you catch a 15-second glimpse on social media, that doesn't necessarily paint a whole what has happened within those, 9 hours and 10 hours. So it doesn't always paint an accurate representation of what's actually happening on the ground.
We know how people feel, and since you were on the ground, you got to experience a lot of this firsthand. What about some of the police officers that you encountered? What was their sentiment? What was some of the perception you were able to get from being on the ground watching them?
I think in every city it's going to be different, right? Based on every city's historic background. For Atlanta, recognized as the Mecca of the Civil Rights Movement, a city where minorities are the majority, the experience here is definitely different than how it might have played out in Nashville, how it might have played out in Denver. So for Atlanta as a city, I think that a lot of the city's cultural background also played into what unfolded. So there was a lot of conversation, and there was also the older generation came out to lead the youth to march in a way that gets their message across without disruption. But then there was also a conversation about how much agitation is needed during moments like this, where you'll do anything to be heard because you have for so long felt silenced by society. So you definitely saw, the old way of doing things intersect with a younger generation that's hungry for change.
Well, speaking about the younger generation, I had a huge conversation with my daughter last night, who's not only an immigrant, but also a person of color, about the huge historical implications of what's going on right now. Is there anything that you can think of to help people to talk to their children about what you're seeing and what's going on?
I think, and I come from an international background. I'm from Somalia, moved to the United States when I was 6 years old, and I've really embraced the African-American history, even as an African woman. It's one that I identify with. But the reason why it has sparked an international global attention is so many different parts of the world can identify with systemic racism, whether it's Northern African regions, whether it's Australia, finally recognizing its own diverse background, whether it's, some of the Arab countries. So I think from that perspective, it's a moment to have solidarity with what's happening in America. As far as the younger generation, what we saw out there on the ground multiple days in a row is they're finally starting to see the power of the hashtag. For so long, it's easy for, situations that happen, negative situations, to go viral, but it gives people, especially Gen Z, an observation to know how powerful it is to trend, and then what happens after the trending topic is no longer trending. And that's the conversation that's being had among the young generation that we're seeing is they want to know what's next, and that's definitely a conversation that needs to continue being had.
We saw folks on the ground there praying. We saw them giving out water bottles and food. We saw them with hand sanitizers, their signs. People have really come together.
To see so many people with hand sanitizers, to see at every corner of the protest in Atlanta, there was snacks, food, water. And like I mentioned earlier, you may catch glimpses of the protests on social media, but it lasts longer than 7 hours some days. It may start around 12 o'clock. So with that perspective, you understand the value of staying hydrated. If each person is walking 10 miles at night protesting around the city, you also know that they need food. So the thoughtfulness, the consideration, and the compassion really shined a light that people are there for one another. And there was just so much diversity from the outcome of how many people came out, that there was unity in making sure that people were not only mobilizing, but amplifying the voices of Black America.
I think the words accountability and responsibility have really emerged out of this current moment. So how can we push the movement forward? And let's talk about allies. How can we all come together on this to create change?
Right. There are a lot of people, supporting the movement, supporting the cause, and the conversation of what's next right now on social media, as some of you are seeing, is support Black-owned businesses, support nonprofits, support each other, make sure that corporations are hiring more people from diverse background, make sure that there is representation on all sides. And there's also a conversation of, who are the real influencers in the culture. We know pop culture, a heavy portion of pop culture is art that Black America creates. So it's, what more is needed to not only embrace the Black culture, but also give representation and to be there for one another.
Like you were saying, you have so many followers that believe in the movement and support because we understand what is happening. But then there are people that don't really understand it. They don't really support it. In fact, they are fueled by other Black activists that say what's happening on the streets now isn't real, that it doesn't have a foundation. What can we say to those people?
I think there's a difference between being a popcorn activist, being a hashtag activist, and also having your foot in the ground and being involved. Being involved in local elections, being involved in state elections, knowing who your commissioners are, knowing who your Board of Education members are. So I think there's different forms of identifying with the movement. You may do it from your keyboard, or you may do it in person. So the different perceptions that we're getting also show the level of dedication, the varying levels of dedication people have to being involved in a long-term conversation and a marathon. But that gap is part of the confusion. People are not seeing the full story because they may not join every aspect of what's unfolding in America right now. But part of the problem is not understanding one another. The root of the issue is you have people in isolated experiences in America where there is no overlap of different groups. And because there is no overlap, the only perception they have of each other is when things are trending for the wrong reason. So if the only time you're talking about Black America is when things happen to Black America, that's part of the problem. So more dialogue definitely is needed to create more understanding and unify all of us as humanity.
Yeah, and the dialogue will continue because it is going to be a marathon and not a sprint. There is a lane for everybody, though. Just because you can't go out to the front lines, you can do other things to be involved because it's going to take all of us to create change. Thank you so much, Neima, for joining us. We appreciate you. Keep doing what you're doing, girl.
Thank you.